In the mahogany-paneled office of Peterson Associates Law Firm, a 62-year-old widowed mother was about to make the most shocking decision of her life. What started as a family dinner conversation about her theatrical behavior took a devastating turn when her successful son delivered a request that would change everything. Margaret Rose Sullivan wasn't your typical wealthy widow. For 35 years, she had built a multi-million-dollar catering empire from scratch, known for her passionate dedication and unfiltered authenticity. When her son told her she was too dramatic and needed to tone it down for his upcoming business merger, she made a decision that would lead to confronting everything about family loyalty and unconditional love. The Sullivan family would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier in Margaret Sullivan's dining room cast warm light across the mahogany table as she carefully arranged the last of the silver place settings. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of catering work, moved with practiced precision despite the arthritis that had been bothering her lately. It was Thursday evening in late September, and the maple trees outside her Victorian home in Westchester County blazed red and gold against the crisp autumn sky. "Daniel," she called toward the second floor, her voice carrying the theatrical flair that had made her legendary in the catering business. "Dinner's almost ready, sweetheart." Daniel emerged from his childhood bedroom, now converted into a home office where he often worked when visiting his mother. At 32, he had inherited his father's tall, lean frame and serious demeanor, but his mother's dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around them. His tailored suit suggested he'd come straight from another high-stakes business meeting. "Smells incredible, Mom," he said, loosening his tie as he surveyed the elaborate spread she'd prepared. Even for a simple family dinner, Margaret had created a feast that could have fed 8 people: herb-crusted salmon, roasted vegetables with exotic spices, homemade sourdough bread, and her famous chocolate soufflé waiting in the oven. "Nothing's too good for my successful son," Margaret beamed, pulling out his chair with a flourish that made the gesture feel like a royal ceremony. "I made all your favorites: the salmon with that dill sauce you love, those roasted carrots with honey and thyme, and wait until you see the soufflé." As they settled into dinner, Margaret launched into animated stories about her latest catering events. Her hands moved expressively as she described the chaos of catering a wedding for 400 guests where the bride's mother had changed the menu 3 times the day before the event. "So there I was," Margaret continued, her voice rising with dramatic intensity, standing in the kitchen at midnight, completely reimagining an entire reception dinner because Princess Bridezilla decided she was suddenly allergic to shellfish, which, by the way, she'd been eating at our tasting sessions for months. Daniel smiled politely, but Margaret noticed the way his jaw tensed slightly, the careful way he cut his salmon into precise pieces. This was the expression he wore when he was trying to be patient with something that irritated him. "The point is," Margaret concluded with a grand gesture, "we pulled it off. The Hendersons were so grateful they've already booked us for their anniversary party next spring. Sometimes, you have to embrace the chaos and turn it into magic." "That's great, Mom," Daniel said, his tone measured. "Your ability to handle crisis situations is definitely impressive." Something in his careful phrasing made Margaret pause. After 32 years of reading her son's moods, she recognized the subtle signals that meant he was building up to say something difficult. "Daniel," she said, setting down her fork, "what's on your mind? You've got that look you used to get before telling me you'd broken something valuable." Daniel took a sip of wine, gathering his thoughts in the methodical way that had made him successful in corporate finance. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Something that affects both of us." The dining room suddenly felt smaller, more intimate. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, giving him her full attention in the way she always had when he needed to share something serious. "The merger I've been working on," Daniel began, "the one with Blackstone Capital Management. It's finally happening. The contracts should be signed within the next 2 months." Margaret's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Daniel, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. Your father would be absolutely thrilled to see what you've accomplished. Thank you, Daniel said, but his expression remained serious. The thing is, Mom, this merger isn't just about business. It's about integration into a very specific corporate culture. The Blackstone partners are traditional, conservative. They place a lot of emphasis on family image and social positioning. A small knot began forming in Margaret's stomach, though she couldn't yet articulate why. What does that mean exactly? She asked. Daniel set down his wine glass and looked directly at her. It means that as part of the integration process, there will be social events. Dinner parties, charity galas, corporate functions where family members are expected to attend. The Blackstone partners want to get to know the families of their new senior executives. That sounds lovely, Margaret said slowly, though the knot in her stomach was tightening. I'd be happy to attend whatever events you need me at. I know you would, Mom, and I appreciate that. But, Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. These are very formal affairs, very understated. The kind of events where conversation is measured, where people speak quietly and avoid drawing attention to themselves. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. Margaret felt her cheeks flush as understanding dawned. Are you saying I'm too loud? She asked, her voice smaller than usual. Not loud, Daniel said quickly. Just enthusiastic, expressive. You tell stories with your whole body, Mom. You laugh from your belly. You cry when you're moved by something. You hug people you've just met. You're dramatic. The word hit Margaret like a slap. Dramatic. It's not necessarily a bad thing, Daniel continued, clearly uncomfortable but pressing forward. It's part of who you are. It's what makes you successful in the catering business. Your clients love your passion and energy, but in these corporate settings, I'm an embarrassment, Margaret finished quietly. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. They sat in silence for a moment, the elaborate dinner growing cold between them. Margaret stared at the flowers she'd arranged as a centerpiece, dramatic dahlias and roses in deep burgundy and gold, chosen because she thought they looked elegant and festive. Now they seemed to mock her with their boldness. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said finally. Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm asking if you could tone it down, just for these events. Speak more quietly. Maybe avoid the elaborate hand gestures. Keep the stories brief and understated. Dress more conservatively. Maybe something in navy or black instead of the bright colors you usually wear. Each suggestion felt like another small wound. Margaret thought about her closet full of jewel-toned dresses and artistic jewelry, her collection of scarves and accessories that reflected her vibrant personality. She thought about the way she naturally connected with people through storytelling and physical warmth. You're asking me to pretend to be someone else, she said. I'm asking you to adapt, the way you've always taught me to do when situations required it. The reference to her own advice stung because it was accurate. Margaret had indeed taught Daniel to read social situations and adjust his behavior accordingly. But somehow, she'd never imagined those lessons would be turned back on her. Mom, Daniel continued, his voice gentler now, this merger represents everything I've worked for. It's my chance to secure not just my future, but yours too. The financial benefits alone would mean you could retire comfortably, maybe even expand the catering business if you wanted to. But I need the Blackstone partners to see me as someone who fits their corporate culture, someone whose family reflects their values. And I don't reflect their values. Not as you are now, no. The honesty was brutal in its simplicity. Margaret felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Daniel another example of her being too dramatic. I see, she said, standing up and beginning to clear the plates with mechanical precision. Well, I suppose I should thank you for being honest with me. Mom, please don't be upset. This isn't about changing who you are fundamentally. It's just about adapting to specific social situations. Margaret paused in her clearing, a plate of untouched salmon in her hands. Daniel, do you know what your father used to say about me when we first started dating? Daniel shook his head. He said I was like a force of nature, that I brought color to every room I entered, that my passion for life was contagious, and he never wanted me to dim that light for anyone. She looked directly at her son. He said that my dramatic nature wasn't a flaw to be managed, it was a gift to be celebrated. Dad was romantic, Daniel said dismissively. This is business. No, Margaret said quietly. This is family. And apparently, I'm the problem that needs to be solved. She walked into the kitchen, leaving Daniel alone at the dining table, surrounded by the evidence of her love. The elaborate meal she'd spent hours preparing, the careful attention to every detail, the dramatic presentation that was so essentially her. As she stood at the kitchen sink, mechanically rinsing dishes, Margaret felt something shifting inside her. For 32 years, she had poured herself into being the best mother she could be. She had built a successful business while raising Daniel as a single mother after her husband's death when the boy was only 8. She had celebrated every achievement, attended every school event, and supported every dream her son had ever expressed. And now he was asking her to become smaller, quieter, less vibrant, so that he could impress people who would judge him based on his family's ability to blend into their conservative expectations. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same dramatic passion that had built the business that would fund Daniel's education and early career investments was now too embarrassing for his corporate advancement. As she heard Daniel's footsteps approaching the kitchen, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't argue or plead or try to convince him that he was wrong. Instead, she would give him exactly what he was asking for, just not in the way he expected. "Mom!" Daniel appeared in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Are you okay?" Margaret turned to face him, her expression perfectly calm and controlled. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You've given me a lot to think about." "So you'll consider what I asked? About adapting your presentation style?" "Oh yes," Margaret said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll definitely be making some changes. Some very dramatic changes." Daniel looked relieved, completely missing the subtle edge in his mother's voice. "Thank you, Mom. I know this isn't easy, but it means everything to me." "I know it does," Margaret replied. "Family should mean everything. That's something I've always believed." As Daniel prepared to leave, promising to call her about the specific dates for the upcoming corporate events, Margaret stood in her kitchen surrounded by the remnants of their dinner, and felt something crystallizing in her mind. She had spent her entire adult life building something meaningful, not just a business, but a legacy of passion, creativity, and authentic connection with people. She had raised a son who was successful, intelligent, and capable of achieving great things, but somehow, in the process, she had failed to teach him the most important lesson of all, that the people who truly matter are the ones who love you exactly as you are, dramatic flourishes and all. Tomorrow, she would make some phone calls, she would schedule some appointments, and she would show Daniel exactly what happened when someone truly dramatic decided to make changes. The chocolate soufflé in the oven had fallen, but Margaret didn't bother to check on it. She had more important things to plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 35 years. The habit was so ingrained that even on her rare days off, her body automatically stirred at 4:30 a.m., ready to begin the careful orchestration that running a successful catering business required. But today, instead of immediately reaching for her phone to check overnight emails from clients, she lay still in the king-sized bed she had once shared with Robert, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word of Daniel's request. The early October air carried a chill that made her pull the down comforter closer around her shoulders. Through the bay windows of her master bedroom, she could see the landscaped gardens she had painstakingly designed over the years. Dramatic sweeps of ornamental grasses, bold plantings of purple asters and golden chrysanthemums, artistic arrangements of decorative gourds and pumpkins that announced autumn's arrival with theatrical flair. Even her garden was too dramatic, she realized with bitter irony. By 5:15, Margaret had given up on sleep and padded downstairs to her kitchen. the heart of both her home and her business. The commercial-grade appliances gleamed in the soft under-cabinet lighting, and the massive island was already set up for the day's prep work. Today's schedule included finalizing the menu for the Peterson anniversary party, a 150-person event celebrating 50 years of marriage, and preparing samples for a potential new corporate client. As she ground coffee beans, the familiar ritual usually brought her comfort and focus. But this morning, the routine felt hollow. Every item in her kitchen told the story of her journey from struggling young widow to successful entrepreneur. The custom spice rack filled with exotic seasonings she had discovered during culinary adventures. The collection of copper pots inherited from her French mentor Chef Dubois, who had taught her that cooking without passion was merely fuel. The walls covered with photographs from hundreds of events, smiling brides, grateful families, corporate executives toasting successful launches. All of it built on the foundation of her dramatic, passionate, unapologetically vibrant approach to life. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and Margaret found herself remembering the early days after Robert's death. Daniel had been only 8 years old, still small enough to curl up in her lap when nightmares about losing his father woke him in the middle of the night. She had been 29, with a part-time job at a local restaurant, and no real plan for supporting herself and her son. The life insurance money had been enough to buy this house and provide a modest cushion, but Margaret had known it wouldn't last forever. She had taught herself to cook by watching television chefs and reading every cookbook she could borrow from the library. Her first catering job had been for her neighbor's book club, 12 women who needed simple refreshments for their monthly meeting. Margaret still remembered the nervousness that had made her hands shake as she arranged the food on borrowed platters. But when the women had tasted her lavender honey shortbread cookies and begun exclaiming over the unexpected sophistication of her presentation, something had clicked into place. This was her calling, creating experiences that surprised and delighted people, turning ordinary gatherings into memorable celebrations. The business had grown slowly at first. Margaret had taken on weekend events while working weekdays at the restaurant, often staying up until 2 a.m. to prep for Saturday weddings or Sunday christenings. Daniel had learned to do his homework in restaurant kitchens and catering vans, had fallen asleep countless times on banquet chairs while his mother cleaned up after events. But he had never once complained. If anything, young Daniel had seemed proud of his mother's work. He would beam when clients praised her food, would solemnly hand out business cards to anyone who complimented the party. He had been her biggest supporter, her motivation during the lean years, when every job mattered desperately. Margaret poured her coffee into the oversized mug Daniel had given her for Mother's Day when he was 12. White ceramic with "World's Most Dramatic Mom," painted in his careful child's handwriting. At the time, they had both laughed at the description. It had been a badge of honor. Now the words felt like an indictment. The joie buccale l'attame. She settled at the breakfast nook, where she did her administrative work, opening her laptop to review the day's schedule. But instead of focusing on vendor orders and staffing assignments, Margaret found herself pulling up the folder of photos from Daniel's childhood and college years. There he was at 6, chocolate cake smeared across his face at the elaborate pirate-themed birthday party she had thrown for him in their backyard. She had spent weeks creating treasure maps and costume accessories, had hired a local actor to play Captain Blackbeard, had transformed their modest yard into a Caribbean adventure. The party had cost more than they could really afford, but Daniel's joy had made every penny worth it. At 10, accepting an award for academic excellence while Margaret beamed from the audience, her applause the loudest in the auditorium. At 14, sulking slightly in his tuxedo before his first formal dance, while Margaret fussed over his boutonniere and took approximately 50 photos. At 18, graduation day from prep school, when Margaret had surprised him by catering a small celebration for his closest friends because she knew he was too shy to ask for a party himself. Through all of it, Margaret had been unabashedly herself, enthusiastic, emotional, dramatic in her love and pride. And Daniel had seemed to appreciate it, had brought friends home specifically to experience his mother's warmth and creativity. When had that changed? When had her passionate nature become a source of embarrassment rather than pride? Margaret scrolled to more recent photos and began to see the shift. Daniel in his 20s. Photos from business events and corporate gatherings where his smile looked more controlled, his posture more rigid. Pictures from the few social events she had attended with him, where she noticed now that she stood out among the other family members with their muted colors and careful postures. There was the photo from his promotion celebration last year, where Margaret had worn a stunning emerald green dress that complemented her silver hair beautifully. She remembered feeling elegant and proud, had received several compliments on her outfit. But looking at the photo now, she could see how her vibrant color and animated expression contrasted sharply with the other women in their safe black cocktail dresses and practiced smiles. Had Daniel been embarrassed that night? Had he spent the evening managing her presence rather than celebrating his achievement? Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant, Christina. "Mrs. Patterson called, wants to add champagne fountain to anniversary party. Should I tell her yes?" Before responding, Margaret found herself thinking about the Pattersons' love story. Harold and Louise had been married for 50 years, had raised 4 children together, had built a small manufacturing business from nothing into a thriving enterprise. Louise Patterson was a tiny, soft-spoken woman who deferred to her husband in public but ran their business operations with quiet efficiency. Harold was courtly and reserved, the kind of man who had probably never raised his voice or made a scene in his entire life. They were the antithesis of Margaret's dramatic nature, yet they had hired her specifically because they wanted their anniversary celebration to be unforgettable and full of personality. They had chosen her over 3 other caterers precisely because of her reputation for creating events that people talked about for years afterward. Margaret typed back, "Tell Mrs. Patterson yes to the champagne fountain. Let's make this celebration as memorable as their love story deserves." But even as she sent the message, she wondered if Daniel would approve of such a dramatic addition. Would he find the champagne fountain excessive, too attention-seeking, for a proper anniversary celebration? The thought made her angry in a way that surprised her. Since when did she need Daniel's approval for business decisions she had been making successfully for decades? Her morning routine continued with calls to vendors, menu adjustments, and staff scheduling. But underneath the familiar tasks, Margaret felt something fundamental shifting. Every decision seemed to carry new weight. Every choice filtered through the lens of Daniel's criticism. Around noon, her longtime friend and business partner, Elena Vasquez, arrived for their weekly planning meeting. Elena had been Margaret's sous chef at the restaurant where they had both worked in the early days, and when Margaret's catering business had grown large enough to require a partner, Elena had been the natural choice. Where Margaret was the creative visionary and client-facing personality, Elena was the operational genius who kept everything running smoothly behind the scenes. "You look like someone who didn't sleep," Elena observed, settling into the breakfast nook with her usual no-nonsense directness. At 55, Elena was 7 years younger than Margaret, but possessed a maternal instinct that often made her the voice of reason in their partnership. "Daniel came for dinner last night," Margaret said, pouring Elena coffee from the pot she had been nursing all morning. "Ah." Elena's expression shifted to one of understanding. "And how is our successful young executive?" There was just enough edge in Elena's voice to remind Margaret that her business partner had never been entirely convinced by Daniel's transformation from passionate, creative child to buttoned-up corporate climber. Elena had known Daniel since he was a teenager, working summer jobs in their catering kitchen, and she had watched his gradual evolution with the skepticism of someone who valued authenticity above all else. "He's getting the merger," Margaret said, "the one he's been working toward for 2 years. "That's wonderful," Elena said, though her tone suggested she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "It comes with certain social expectations." Margaret found herself recounting the previous evening's conversation, watching Elena's expression grow darker with each detail. When she reached Daniel's request for her to tone down her dramatic nature, Elena set down her coffee mug with enough force to make Margaret wince. "That ungrateful little—" Elena caught herself, moderating her language but not her sentiment. "Margaret, please tell me you didn't agree to this ridiculous request." "I told him I would make some changes." "What kind of changes?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering how to articulate the plan that had been forming in her mind since the previous evening. The kind that will teach him exactly what he's asking for. Elena studied her friend's face, recognizing the expression that had appeared countless times over the years, when Margaret was plotting something particularly creative and potentially outrageous. "Margaret Rose Sullivan," Elena said slowly, "what are you planning to do?" "I'm planning to give my son exactly what he wants," Margaret replied with a smile that was both sweet and dangerous. A mother who won't embarrass him with her dramatic tendencies. How? By removing the drama from his life entirely. Starting with removing myself from his inheritance. The words hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Elena's eyes widened as the implications became clear. You're going to change your will. I'm going to dramatically change my will, Margaret corrected. It seems only fitting, don't you think? The law offices of Peterson Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming high-rise in downtown White Plains, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the Hudson Valley. Margaret had been a client of the firm for 15 years, ever since her business had grown large enough to require serious legal counsel for contracts, liability issues, and estate planning. But as she sat in the marble-floored lobby at precisely 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon, she felt like she was entering foreign territory. Mrs. Sullivan? The receptionist's voice carried the kind of polished professionalism that came with working at a prestigious law firm. Mr. Peterson will see you now. Margaret followed the young woman down a hallway lined with oil paintings of the firm's founding partners, their stern faces seeming to judge her from their gilded frames. She had dressed carefully for this appointment. A charcoal gray suit that Elena had helped her select, paired with minimal jewelry and her hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. If she was going to discuss removing drama from her life, she supposed she should start by removing it from her appearance. James Peterson rose from behind his massive oak desk as she entered his corner office. At 68, he was one of the most respected estate attorneys in Westchester County, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had handled Robert's life insurance claims after his death, and had guided Margaret through the legal complexities of building her business. More importantly, he had known her family for over a decade, and had watched Daniel grow from a shy teenager into a successful young man. "Margaret," he said warmly, coming around the desk to greet her with a brief hug. "You look lovely, though I have to say I'm intrigued by your call. It's not often someone requests an urgent appointment to completely overhaul their estate plan." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, James," Margaret replied, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "I know this seems sudden, but I've had some time to reflect on my priorities, and I think it's time for some significant changes." James returned to his seat and pulled out a legal pad, his expression shifting from social warmth to professional attention. "Your current will is quite straightforward. The bulk of your estate goes to Daniel, with smaller bequests to several charities and your employee pension fund. Are you looking to add beneficiaries, or are we talking about more substantial modifications?" Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to set in motion. "I want to remove Daniel as my primary beneficiary entirely." The pen in James's hand stopped moving. He looked up at her with the careful expression of someone who had heard many family disputes over the years, but was still occasionally surprised by their scope. "Margaret, that's certainly a dramatic change. May I ask what's prompted this decision?" "My son has made it clear that my dramatic tendencies are problematic for his career advancement. He's asked me to fundamentally change who I am to accommodate his professional needs, so I've decided to remove the drama from his life entirely." James set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's face with the practiced eye of someone who had navigated countless family crises. "I see. And you've discussed this decision with Daniel?" "Not yet. I thought it would be more appropriate to have the legal documents prepared first." "Margaret," James said gently, "I've known you and Daniel for many years. I've watched you build an incredibly successful business while raising a remarkable young man. I've also seen how much you both mean to each other. Are you certain this is the path you want to take?" Margaret felt her resolve waver slightly under his paternal concern. James had been more than just her attorney over the years. He had been a trusted advisor during some of her most difficult business decisions, and his opinion mattered to her. "James, let me ask you something," she said. "In all the years you've known me, have you ever found my personality excessive, too dramatic for professional settings?" James was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Margaret, you have one of the most vibrant, authentic personalities I've ever encountered. Your passion is what's made you successful in a very competitive industry. It's what's made your business something special rather than just another catering service." "That's not what I asked." No, he admitted. You asked if I found you excessive. And the honest answer is that there have been times when your enthusiasm has been quite pronounced. But I've also seen you dial it back when the situation required it. You're perfectly capable of reading a room and adjusting your approach accordingly. The observation stung because it highlighted what felt like Daniel's fundamental lack of faith in her social intelligence. But my son doesn't believe I'm capable of that adjustment. What exactly did Daniel say to you? Margaret found herself recounting the dinner conversation for the second time in 2 days. But this time the words felt even more painful as she spoke them aloud in the formal setting of James's office. When she finished, James was quiet for several minutes, making notes on his legal pad. I can certainly draft the changes you're requesting, he said finally. But I feel obligated to point out some potential consequences you may not have considered. Such as, well, for one thing, completely disinheriting Daniel would likely come as a shock not just to him but to anyone who knows your family. You've spent 32 years building a business that you've always said was as much for his future as for your own success. Margaret nodded. I'm aware of that. More practically, if Daniel is truly on the verge of a significant merger, cutting him out of your will might actually create the kind of family drama that could jeopardize his business prospects far more than you're attending a few corporate dinner parties. This was an angle Margaret hadn't fully considered. Her intention had been to remove herself as a source of embarrassment for Daniel, but James was right that a family financial scandal could be far more damaging to his corporate reputation than having a dramatic mother. Then what do you suggest? She asked. James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. There are other ways to make your point. Ways that would be educational, without being destructive. I'm listening. You could establish conditions for his inheritance. Requirements that would ensure Daniel truly understands the value of what you've built and what you've sacrificed for his success. Margaret felt a spark of interest. What kind of conditions? Well, you could require that Daniel work in your business for a specified period before accessing his inheritance. A year, perhaps. Learning every aspect of what you've created. He'd have to interact with your clients, manage events, understand what it really means to build something from nothing. The idea had merit, but it didn't address the core issue that was driving Margaret's anger. That would certainly be educational, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. Daniel is ashamed of who I am. Then let's address that directly, James said, pulling out a fresh legal pad. What if we created a will that forced Daniel to make a choice? He could inherit everything, but only under conditions that would require him to publicly embrace the very traits he's asked you to suppress. Margaret leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. What do you mean? What if Daniel could only access his inheritance by working as your full partner in the catering business for 2 years? Not as silent partner or financial advisor, but as an active participant in client meetings, event planning, the works. He'd have to embrace the dramatic, passionate approach that makes your business successful. He'd have to become dramatic himself, Margaret said slowly, beginning to see the elegant irony of the proposal. Exactly. Or he could choose to walk away from the inheritance entirely and continue with his corporate career, but he'd be doing so with the full knowledge of what he was giving up. Margaret felt something shifting in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, but a sense that there might be a path forward that didn't require completely severing her relationship with her son. There's another element we could add, James continued, clearly warming to the creative challenge. We could include a provision that if Daniel chooses to reject the inheritance, it would go to a foundation you'd establish to support other dramatic, passionate entrepreneurs, specifically single mothers building businesses. A foundation that would celebrate exactly the traits Daniel wants me to suppress, Margaret said, and for the first time in 2 days, she felt genuinely excited about something. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Entrepreneurial Excellence, James suggested, with a mission statement that specifically mentions supporting business owners who refuse to dim their authentic personalities to fit conventional expectations. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city where she had built her business, raised her son, and created a life that she had always been proud of. The foundation idea felt right in a way that simply cutting Daniel out of her will hadn't. How long would it take to draft these documents? She asked. With conditions this complex, probably 2 weeks to get everything properly structured and reviewed. And in the meantime, James said with a slight smile, You attend those corporate events Daniel mentioned and show him exactly what you're capable of when you choose to. Margaret turned back to face him. Meaning? Meaning you demonstrate that you can be appropriately dignified and refined when the situation calls for it, but that you're choosing to do so as yourself, not as some diminished version of who you are. And if he still insists that I'm too dramatic, then he'll have some very interesting decisions to make when we read him the new will. As Margaret left the law office 40 minutes later, she felt lighter than she had since Daniel's dinner request. She wasn't abandoning her plan to change her will. If anything, the new version would be far more educational than her original impulse to simply disinherit him. But now she also had a strategy for the immediate future, a way to show Daniel that his assumptions about her ability to navigate his corporate world were as misguided as his belief that she needed to change who she was fundamentally. The next few weeks would certainly be dramatic, but for the first time since this whole crisis began, Margaret was looking forward to the performance. The Westchester Country Club had been hosting exclusive business dinners for over a century, its Georgian brick facade and manicured grounds serving as the backdrop for countless deals, mergers, and strategic partnerships. As Margaret's Uber pulled into the circular drive on Tuesday evening, she observed the parade of luxury vehicles depositing their impeccably dressed passengers at the main entrance. BMWs, Mercedes, and the occasional Bentley gleamed under the warm glow of the club's entrance lights, while valets in crisp uniforms moved with practiced efficiency. Margaret had chosen her outfit with the precision of a general preparing for battle. The midnight blue silk dress was elegant, without being flashy, its classic cut flattering her figure while maintaining the conservative aesthetic Daniel had requested. Her jewelry was limited to simple pearl earrings and her wedding ring, no dramatic statement pieces or bold accessories that might draw unwanted attention. Even her makeup was subdued, enhancing her natural features without the dramatic flair she typically enjoyed. "You look like you're attending a funeral," she had told her reflection that afternoon, and the comparison wasn't entirely inaccurate. In many ways, she was mourning the vibrant version of herself that Daniel found so problematic. The club's interior was exactly what Margaret had expected. Mahogany paneling, oil portraits of long-dead members, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that suggested important conversations happening in every corner. She spotted Daniel immediately near the bar, his tall frame elegant in a charcoal suit, as he spoke with two older men in matching navy blazers. Even from across the room, she could see the careful tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself with rigid professionalism. "Mom," Daniel said as she approached, his smile bright but not quite reaching his eyes. "You look wonderful. Very sophisticated." The pause before sophisticated told Margaret everything she needed to know about his assessment. He was pleased but slightly surprised by her restrained appearance, as if he hadn't been entirely confident in her ability to dress appropriately for the occasion. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice pitched at the modulated tone she had been practicing all week. "I wanted to make sure I represented your achievements properly." Daniel's relief was almost palpable as he turned to make introductions. "This is my mother, Margaret Sullivan. Mom, I'd like you to meet Richard Blackstone, senior partner at Blackstone Capital Management, and Thomas Whitfield, our head of client relations." Margaret extended her hand with practiced grace, her handshake firm but not overwhelming, her smile warm but controlled. "It's such a pleasure to meet you both. Daniel has spoken about this partnership opportunity with enormous enthusiasm." "The pleasure is ours, Mrs. Sullivan," Richard Blackstone replied. At 62, he possessed the kind of silver-haired gravitas that came with decades of high-stakes financial decisions. His accent carried hints of old money and Ivy League educations. "Daniel has been an exceptional addition to our preliminary discussions. You should be very proud." "I am," Margaret said simply, resisting the urge to launch into the kind of elaborate praise for her son that would normally flow naturally from her lips. "He's always been remarkably focused and determined." The conversation continued in this careful vein as they moved toward their assigned table. Margaret found herself seated between Thomas Whitfield's wife Patricia and the spouse of another potential partner, a woman named Caroline Huntington, who radiated the kind of understated wealth that came from never having to think about money. "What a lovely dress," Patricia Whitfield commented as they settled into their seats. "Is that Armani?" "Thank you," Margaret replied without identifying the designer. Partly because she wasn't certain, and partly because she suspected the truth that it came from Nordstrom Rack might not fit the expected narrative. "And what do you do, Margaret?" Caroline asked, her tone carrying the polite interest of someone making required social conversation. This was the moment Margaret had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. How did one describe running a catering business to women who likely hadn't worked a day in their lives? "I own a hospitality business," Margaret said carefully. "We specialize in creating memorable experiences for special occasions." It wasn't technically a lie, but it was such a sanitized version of her passionate, hands-on approach to catering that it felt like describing a tiger as a large cat. "How interesting," Caroline said with the kind of smile that suggested she found it anything but interesting. "That must keep you quite busy." "It does," Margaret agreed, "though I find great satisfaction in helping families celebrate their most important moments." The conversation moved on to safer topics: vacation destinations, cultural events, and the mild gossip that seemed to circulate endlessly among this particular social stratum. Margaret participated appropriately, offering observations that were thoughtful but not passionate, engaging but not effusive. As the first course arrived, some sort of artfully arranged salad that involved more decoration than substance, Margaret caught Daniel watching her with what appeared to be approval. She was performing exactly as he had requested, blending seamlessly into the conservative social landscape of his business associates. But with each careful comment, each modulated response, each suppressed instinct to tell a story or share an enthusiasm, Margaret felt something inside her withering. This wasn't adaptation, it was erasure. She was becoming a shadow of herself, a carefully controlled version designed to meet other people's expectations, rather than express her authentic self. The irony wasn't lost on her that in her professional life, she had built a reputation precisely by being herself, by bringing passion and creativity to every event, by connecting with clients through genuine enthusiasm and authentic emotion. The corporate wives surrounding her probably employed caterers exactly like her to bring life and personality to their own social gatherings, while simultaneously expecting her to suppress those very qualities in their presence. "Margaret," Richard Blackstone's voice drew her attention back to the table conversation. "Daniel mentioned that you've been quite successful in your business endeavors. How long have you been in the hospitality industry?" The question felt like a test, though Margaret wasn't entirely sure what the correct answer was supposed to be. "I started my company about 30 years ago," she said. "It's been quite a journey." 30 years, Thomas Whitfield observed. "That's remarkable longevity in any field. You must have quite a gift for customer relations." "I believe in treating every client like family," Margaret replied, then immediately wondered if that response was too warm, too personal for this setting. But surprisingly, several people around the table nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of personal service philosophy that seems to be disappearing these days," Patricia Whitfield commented. "Everything's so impersonal now, so corporate." "I agree completely," Caroline added. "It's refreshing to meet someone who still believes in authentic customer connections." Margaret felt a flicker of irony at being praised for authenticity while working so hard to suppress her authentic self, but she simply smiled and thanked them for the compliment. As the evening progressed through multiple courses and increasingly complex business discussions, Margaret began to notice something unexpected. While she was successfully maintaining the restrained demeanor Daniel had requested, she was also finding the other corporate spouses more interesting than she had anticipated. Beneath their polished surfaces, several of them revealed glimpses of intelligence, humor, and even passion for their own interests and causes. Patricia Whitfield, it turned out, was deeply involved in literacy programs for underprivileged children and spoke with genuine emotion about the importance of educational equity. Caroline Huntington had founded a nonprofit organization that provided business mentorship for women entrepreneurs and displayed a sharp understanding of the challenges facing small business owners. These women weren't the shallow social climbers Margaret had expected. They were accomplished, thoughtful people who had simply learned to package their personalities in ways that fit their social expectations. The realization was both comforting and deeply troubling. If these women could maintain their authenticity while adapting their presentation, perhaps Daniel's request wasn't entirely unreasonable. But it also raised the question of why adaptations seemed to require such complete suppression of the qualities that made her unique. As coffee and dessert were served, Richard Blackstone raised his glass in a toast. "To new partnerships and the families that support our success," he said, his gaze encompassing the entire table. "Behind every successful professional is a network of people who understand that achievement requires both individual excellence and collective support." Margaret lifted her glass along with everyone else, but the words felt loaded with meaning she wasn't sure she understood. Was this acknowledgement of family support, or a subtle reminder that family members were expected to play supporting rather than starring roles? As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Daniel appeared at her elbow, his expression more relaxed than she had seen it in months. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly as they walked toward the valet stand. "You are perfect tonight. Exactly what I knew you could be when you put your mind to it." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions at his praise. Part of her was gratified that she had successfully met his expectations, but a larger part was troubled by the implication that being perfect required her to become someone else entirely. "I'm glad the evening went well for you," she said as they waited for their respective cars. "It went better than well," Daniel said, his excitement barely contained. "Blackstone pulled me aside during coffee. They're moving forward with the final paperwork. This partnership is really happening, Mom." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm very proud of you." Daniel hugged her briefly, and Margaret caught a whiff of his cologne, the same scent Robert had worn for special occasions. For a moment, her son felt like the little boy who used to fall asleep in her arms after particularly exhausting catering events. "I know this hasn't been easy," Daniel said as they broke apart, "changing your natural style for these business situations. But you proved tonight that you can adapt when it matters. It means everything to me." As Margaret's Uber arrived and she settled into the back seat for the ride home, she reflected on the evening's mixed messages. She had succeeded in Daniel's terms, had proven she could navigate his corporate world without embarrassing him. But the cost of that success felt higher than she had anticipated. She had spent the evening being praised for qualities, authenticity, family values, personal service, that were fundamental to who she was, while simultaneously suppressing the passionate expression of those very qualities that Daniel found problematic. The contradiction was giving her a headache, but it was also crystallizing her resolve about the decision she had made in James Peterson's office. If Daniel wanted a mother who could be turned on and off like a performance, he was about to learn exactly what that choice would cost him. The Saturday morning farmers market in Tarrytown buzzed with its usual weekend energy. Families pushing strollers past stalls overflowing with autumn produce, couples debating the merits of different apple varieties, and vendors calling out daily specials in voices that carried genuine enthusiasm for their wares. Margaret had been coming to this market for over 20 years, first as a young mother looking for affordable fresh ingredients, later as a successful businesswoman seeking inspiration for seasonal menus. Today, she walked through the familiar rows with Elena, their weekly tradition of market shopping feeling more necessary than ever. After 3 days of replaying the corporate dinner in her mind, Margaret needed the honest simplicity of farmers discussing their harvest and artisans passionate about their crafts. "You're doing it again," Elena observed as they paused at a vendor selling handcrafted pottery. Margaret had been examining a vibrant ceramic bowl painted in swirls of orange and gold, but she set it down without purchasing it. "Doing what?" "Censoring yourself. 3 weeks ago, you would have bought that bowl without hesitation because it reminded you of autumn leaves. Now you're second-guessing whether it's too colorful, too dramatic for your kitchen." Margaret looked back at the bowl, recognizing the truth in Elena's observation. The piece was beautiful, exactly the kind of artistic touch that usually drew her eye. But she had found herself wondering if Daniel would approve of such an exuberant addition to her home decor. "Maybe I'm just being more thoughtful about my purchases," Margaret said, but even she could hear how unconvincing that sounded. Elena purchased the bowl without comment and handed it to Margaret. "My treat. Consider it an intervention." They continued through the market, Elena chatting easily with vendors they had known for years while Margaret maintained a more reserved demeanor than usual. At the Murphy family's organic vegetable stand, young Kevin Murphy bounded over with his characteristic enthusiasm. "Mrs. Sullivan." Mom said you might be interested in our new winter squash varieties for your catering menus. We've got this amazing butternut that's been getting incredible reviews from the restaurants in the city. Normally, Margaret would have matched Kevin's excitement, asking detailed questions about growing conditions and harvest timing, probably ending up in an animated discussion about creative preparation techniques. Instead, she found herself simply nodding politely and taking the information card he offered. "Thank you, Kevin. I'll review the options and get back to you." The young man's face fell slightly at her restrained response, clearly expecting the kind of passionate engagement that had characterized their interactions for the past 5 years. Elena stepped in smoothly, asking the questions Margaret would normally have posed, but Margaret could see the confusion in Kevin's eyes. As they walked away from the stand, Elena's expression had shifted from concerned to genuinely angry. "Margaret, what the hell is happening to you?" "What do you mean? You just treated that boy like he was a telemarketer, instead of someone whose family has been supplying our business for years. Kevin Murphy worships you. You've been mentoring him about the food industry since he was in high school, and you acted like you barely knew him." Margaret felt a flush of shame. Elena was right. Her interaction with Kevin had been cold and professional when it should have been warm and encouraging. "I was just being appropriate." "Appropriate?" Elena's voice rose enough to draw looks from nearby shoppers. "Since when is showing genuine interest in people inappropriate?" They found a bench near the market's small cafe area, settling down with cups of locally roasted coffee and the artisanal pastries that Elena insisted they needed for this conversation. "Tell me what happened at Daniel's corporate dinner," Elena said, her tone gentler but still firm. "And I mean really tell me. Not the sanitized version you gave me on Thursday." Margaret found herself recounting the evening in detail, the careful preparation, the restrained conversation, Daniel's obvious relief at her controlled behavior, and his praise for being perfect. As she spoke, Elena's expression grew increasingly troubled. "And you felt good about this performance?" Elena asked when Margaret finished. "I felt successful. I proved I could adapt to his professional environment without embarrassing him." "But did you feel like yourself?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret sipped her coffee, watching a family at a nearby table where the parents were enthusiastically helping their young daughter choose between different types of locally made jam. The child's excitement was infectious, her parents matching her energy as they discussed the merits of strawberry versus blueberry preserves. "No," Margaret admitted quietly. "I felt like I was playing a role, like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit." And Daniel's response to this performance? He was thrilled. He said I was exactly what he knew I could be when I put my mind to it. Elena was quiet for several minutes, her expression cycling through disappointment, anger, and something that looked like grief. "Margaret, do you remember when we first met?" "Of course. The restaurant kitchen at Chez Laurent. You were the only person who didn't think I was crazy for wanting to start my own catering business. Do you remember why I thought you could succeed when everyone else was skeptical?" Margaret smiled at the memory. "You said I had fire, that I brought passion to everything I touched, and that people would pay for that kind of authentic energy. And I was right, wasn't I? Your dramatic, passionate, unapologetically enthusiastic approach to food and events is exactly what built our business. Clients don't hire Sullivan Catering for basic food service. They hire us because you transform their occasions into experiences they'll remember forever. I know that." "Do you?" "Because the woman I watched interact with Kevin Murphy today wasn't the same person who spent 2 hours last month helping him develop a business plan for expanding his family's farm stand. The Margaret Sullivan who built this business would have been excited about winter squash varieties, not politely dismissive." Elena pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photo gallery, stopping at a picture from a wedding they had catered the previous spring. In the image, Margaret was in the middle of the dance floor, having been pulled into a traditional Greek circle dance by the bride's enthusiastic relatives. Her face was flushed with laughter, her hair slightly disheveled from the energetic dancing, and her expression radiated pure joy. "This is who you are," Elena said, showing Margaret the photo. "This woman who celebrates life so fully that she gets pulled into every family's most treasured moments." The bride's grandmother told me that your participation in their dance made the reception feel like a real family celebration instead of just another party. Margaret studied the image, remembering the evening clearly. The bride's family had been initially reserved, worried that their traditional customs might seem too ethnic or overwhelming for the other guests. But Margaret's genuine enthusiasm for their music and customs had encouraged them to celebrate authentically, and the entire reception had been transformed into something magical as a result. Daniel would be horrified by that photo, Margaret said. Why? Because you're showing genuine emotion? Because you're connecting with people across cultural and generational lines? Because you're demonstrating exactly the kind of authentic leadership that builds successful businesses? Elena's voice was getting stronger, more passionate, and Margaret found herself envying her friend's ability to express her feelings without worrying about whether they were appropriate for the setting. Because I look undignified. My hair is messy, I'm sweating from dancing, and I'm clearly the center of attention in a way that draws focus from the actual celebrants. You look alive, Elena corrected firmly. You look like someone who understands that life is meant to be celebrated, not endured with polite restraint. A young couple at the next table had been listening to their conversation with growing interest, and now the woman leaned over slightly. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "But are you Margaret Sullivan from Sullivan Catering?" Margaret nodded, immediately feeling self-conscious about being recognized in public while having such a personal conversation. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "You catered my sister's wedding last year, the Rodriguez celebration in Bronxville. Your team was amazing, but what I remember most was how you made my grandmother feel included. She was so worried about fitting in with my sister's in-laws, but you spent time learning about her family recipes and even incorporated some of her suggestions into the menu. She's still talking about how welcome you made her feel." After the couple left, Elena looked at Margaret with raised eyebrows. "That's the third time this month someone has approached you in public to thank you for making their event special. Not for providing adequate catering service, but for creating experiences that mattered to their families. I know my business is successful, Elena. That's not the issue. Isn't it? Because it seems to me that Daniel is asking you to suppress the exact qualities that made you successful in the first place. The passion, the enthusiasm, the ability to connect with people authentically. These aren't personality flaws that need to be managed. They're your professional strengths." Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back, not wanting to create a scene in the middle of the farmer's market. But Elena's words were hitting too close to home, forcing her to confront the fundamental contradiction between who she was and who Daniel wanted her to become. "What if he's right, though?" Margaret asked quietly. "What if my dramatic nature really is inappropriate for his corporate world? What if I am too much?" Elena reached across the small table and grasped Margaret's hands, her expression fierce with protective loyalty. "Margaret Rose Sullivan, listen to me very carefully. You are not too much. You are not too dramatic. You are not too passionate. You are exactly enough of everything that matters: love, creativity, authenticity, and courage. If Daniel's corporate world can't appreciate those qualities, then it's their loss, not your failing. But it's his world now. His chosen profession, his path to success. Then maybe it's time for Daniel to decide what kind of success he really wants. The kind that requires him to be ashamed of the woman who made his achievements possible, or the kind that allows him to celebrate where he came from and who he really is." As they packed up their market purchases and prepared to leave, Elena made one final observation that would stay with Margaret for the rest of the day. "You know what's really ironic about this whole situation? Daniel is asking you to become less dramatic, right when you're planning the most dramatic gesture of your entire life. Maybe the real question isn't whether you're too dramatic. Maybe it's whether you're being dramatic enough." The comment left Margaret thinking about the new will still being drafted in James Peterson's office, and wondering if her carefully planned legal maneuver was actually the most authentic response she could have to Daniel's request. After all, if her son wanted less drama in his life, removing his dramatic mother from his inheritance would certainly accomplish that goal, just not in the way he was expecting. The annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala was the social event of the season in Westchester County. held every November in the grand ballroom of the historic Hudson Manor. Margaret had attended the gala for the past 8 years, not as a guest seeking social status, but as a major donor whose catering business had become successful enough to support causes she cared deeply about. This year, however, her invitation had come through Daniel, who explained that several Blackstone Capital partners would be attending, and it would be an excellent opportunity for continued relationship building. As Margaret prepared for the evening, she found herself once again carefully curating her appearance to meet Daniel's expectations. The black cocktail dress was elegant but understated, her jewelry minimal and classic. She had even practiced conversations in front of her bedroom mirror, rehearsing responses that would be appropriately refined and measured. The ballroom was a study in understated elegance, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in cream linens, centerpieces of white orchids, and autumn foliage arranged with museum-quality precision. Margaret recognized the work of Pemberton Events, her most successful competitor, and had to admit they had created a beautiful but safe aesthetic that would offend no one, while inspiring no one either. "Mom, you look perfect," Daniel said as he met her near the registration table. His approval carried the same relieved undertone she had noticed at the corporate dinner, as if he had been genuinely worried about her ability to dress appropriately. They were seated at table 12, strategically positioned near enough to the Blackstone partners to demonstrate their inclusion in the inner circle, but far enough from the head table to maintain appropriate hierarchy. Margaret found herself between Dr. Jonathan Prescott, the hospital's chief pediatric surgeon, and Amanda Richardson, whose husband headed the foundation's board of directors. The conversation at their table began with the usual pleasantries about the venue and the cause, but Margaret quickly realized she was navigating more complex social dynamics than she had anticipated. Amanda Richardson, she discovered, was conducting subtle assessments of everyone at the table, weighing their social value and potential usefulness to her various charitable committees. "Margaret, Daniel tells me you're in the hospitality business," Amanda said with the kind of smile that was both welcoming and evaluative. "How fascinating. We're always looking for fresh talent for our various fundraising events. I'd be happy to discuss any way I might contribute," Margaret replied carefully, though internally she bristled at being described as fresh talent, when her business had been operating successfully longer than Amanda had been married to her wealthy husband. "Wonderful. We're planning a spring luncheon that will require someone who understands discretion. Our donors appreciate elegance without ostentation, if you know what I mean." Margaret did know what she meant, and the implication that Sullivan Catering might be too flashy for Amanda's refined clientele was both insulting and sadly predictable. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the evening's main speaker, a young girl named Sophia Martinez, who had been a patient at the Children's Hospital for most of her 12 years. Sophia had been born with a rare heart condition that had required multiple surgeries and ongoing treatment, but tonight she stood at the podium with the confidence of someone much older, prepared to thank the donors who had made her care possible. "Good evening," Sophia began, her clear voice carrying easily through the ballroom's sound system. "My name is Sophia Martinez, and I'm here tonight because people like you believed that every child deserves a chance at a full life." As Sophia continued her speech, describing her medical journey with a combination of vulnerability and strength that was genuinely moving, Margaret found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the girl's story. This was exactly the kind of authentic human connection that had always drawn Margaret to charitable work, not the social networking or tax benefits, but the real impact on real lives. "When I was 8, Sophia continued, I had to spend 3 months in the hospital after my biggest surgery. I was scared and lonely, and I missed my family terribly. But the nurses and doctors didn't just take care of my heart. They took care of my spirit, too. They brought me books and art supplies, they celebrated my small victories, and they made me feel like I was brave enough to get through anything." Margaret felt tears welling up as she listened to Sophia's description of the hospital staff's compassion. This was exactly why she supported the foundation. Not for social recognition, but because she understood what it meant to need support during life's most difficult moments. As Sophia concluded her remarks to thunderous applause, Margaret instinctively began to clap with the same enthusiastic appreciation she would have shown at any other meaningful performance. But she caught herself after a few beats, moderating her response to match the polite applause around her table. Dr. Prescott, who had been watching Margaret's reaction, leaned over with a slight smile. "Sophia is remarkable, isn't she?" That young lady has been through more medical procedures than most adults, but she never loses her optimism. She's extraordinary, Margaret agreed, her voice carrying more emotion than she had intended to reveal. Her courage is, inspiring doesn't seem like a strong enough word. You know, Dr. Prescott continued, Sophia mentioned art supplies in her speech. We've been trying to expand our creative therapy programs, but it's challenging to find donors who understand that healing involves more than just medical treatment. Margaret found herself genuinely engaged for the first time all evening. What kind of creative programs are you developing? Art therapy, music therapy, storytelling workshops, anything that helps children express themselves and process their experiences. We've seen remarkable results, but the programs require ongoing funding for supplies and specialized staff. Before Margaret could respond, Amanda Richardson inserted herself into the conversation with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to managing social interactions. Dr. Prescott, how wonderful that you're expanding the hospital's offerings. I'm sure our foundation board would love to hear more about funding opportunities that provide measurable outcomes. The phrase measurable outcomes felt like code for programs that would generate positive publicity rather than genuine impact, and Margaret found herself thinking about Sophia's description of nurses who took care of her spirit. How exactly did one measure the outcome of helping a frightened child feel brave? As the formal program continued with additional speakers and fundraising presentations, Margaret observed the audience around her. The applause was consistently polite and appropriate, the reactions carefully modulated to demonstrate proper appreciation without excessive enthusiasm. Even when a video presentation showed children celebrating successful treatments with pure, unrestrained joy, the adult audience maintained their dignified composure. The contrast was stark and troubling. Here was a room full of people who had the resources to make genuine differences in children's lives, but they seemed more concerned with maintaining their social composure than connecting authentically with the cause they were supposedly supporting. During the dinner service, Margaret found herself in conversation with Patricia Blackstone, Richard's wife, who had been seated at the adjacent table but had stopped by during the cocktail reception. Margaret, I understand you've been a foundation supporter for several years, Patricia said. What originally drew you to the Children's Hospital as a cause? For a moment, Margaret considered giving the kind of measured, appropriate response that Daniel would approve of. But something about Patricia's genuine interest, combined with the emotional impact of Sophia's speech, made her choose honesty instead. My husband died when my son was 8 years old, Margaret said quietly. We spent a lot of time in hospital waiting rooms during his final illness, and I saw how the medical staff treated the children who were patients there. Even when they were dealing with life and death situations, they took time to make the kids feel special, to celebrate small victories, to bring joy into frightening circumstances. Patricia's expression softened with understanding. That must have been incredibly difficult for your family. It was, but watching how the hospital staff supported not just the medical needs, but the emotional and spiritual needs of their young patients, it showed me what real compassion looks like. When my business became successful enough to give back, the Children's Hospital was the obvious choice. That's a beautiful motivation, Patricia said, and Margaret was surprised to hear genuine warmth in her voice rather than the polite distance she had expected. Their conversation was interrupted by the evening's live auction, featuring vacation packages and luxury items donated by local businesses. Margaret bid successfully on a weekend getaway to a Berkshire's resort, partly because she needed a vacation, but mostly because she wanted to support the fundraising efforts. As the auction concluded and guests began moving toward the ballroom's reception area for coffee and continued socializing, Daniel appeared at Margaret's elbow, his expression mixing pride with something that looked like surprise. Mom, Patricia Blackstone just told me about your conversation regarding the foundation. She was really impressed by your personal connection to the cause. I was just being honest about why I support the hospital, Margaret replied. Well, it was exactly the right thing to say. Patricia mentioned that she's been looking for someone with authentic passion for children's causes to join the Foundation's Program Development Committee. She wants to recommend you for membership. Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. On one hand, she was pleased that her genuine commitment to the cause had been recognized. On the other hand, she was troubled by Daniel's implication that her honesty had been strategic rather than authentic. "That's wonderful," she said carefully, "though I hope she's recommending me because she believes I could contribute meaningfully, not because it would be politically advantageous for your business relationship." Daniel looked taken aback by her comment. "Of course she thinks you could contribute, but it doesn't hurt that the Blackstone partners are seeing you as someone who shares their values and could be a valuable addition to their social circle." "Their social circle?" Margaret repeated slowly. "Yes, you're proving that you can navigate this world, Mom, that you can be part of the community that supports my career advancement." As they prepared to leave the gala, Margaret reflected on the evening's mixed messages. She had been praised for the authentic emotion that had led her to support the Children's Hospital. But she was simultaneously being valued for her ability to suppress that same emotional authenticity in social settings. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Daniel wanted her to be passionate enough to be interesting, and committed enough to be valuable, but controlled enough to never make anyone uncomfortable with the intensity of her feelings. Standing in the valet line waiting for their cars, Margaret made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. When James Peterson called next week to tell her the new will was ready for signing, she would schedule the appointment immediately. It was time for Daniel to learn what happened when someone asked their mother to choose between authentic love and appropriate behavior. The choice, it turned out, was easier than she had expected. The Peterson Associates conference room felt different on this gray November morning, its mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, and formal legal documents arranged with the precision of surgical instruments. Margaret sat across from James Peterson, watching him review the final draft of her new will one last time before the official signing. The document represented 2 weeks of careful legal crafting, transforming her moment of angry impulse into a sophisticated instrument of education that would force Daniel to confront exactly what he was asking her to sacrifice. "I want to review the key provisions one final time," James said, adjusting his reading glasses as he opened the bound document, "to ensure you're completely comfortable with these decisions before we make them legally binding." Margaret nodded, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she had been practicing for weeks. But beneath her calm exterior, her heart was racing with the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. "The primary change, of course, is the conditional inheritance structure for Daniel," James began. "Instead of receiving your estate outright, Daniel would inherit everything, only if he meets specific requirements within 1 year of your passing. Requirements that mirror exactly what he's asked me to suppress about myself," Margaret said quietly. "Precisely. Daniel would be required to work full-time as your successor in Sullivan Catering for a minimum of 2 years, actively participating in client meetings, event planning, and all public-facing aspects of the business. He would need to demonstrate the same passionate, enthusiastic approach to client relations that has made your company successful." Margaret smiled at the elegant irony. "He would have to become dramatically invested in the business in order to inherit it. The legal language is more formal, but yes, that's the essence of it. Additionally, he would be required to maintain the company's current culture and client service philosophy, which we've defined using direct quotes from your business mission statement about bringing authentic passion and creativity to every celebration. And if he chooses not to meet these requirements, then the entire estate would transfer to the Margaret Sullivan Foundation for Entrepreneurial Excellence, which we've structured to specifically support single mothers building businesses. The Foundation's mission statement explicitly celebrates dramatic passion and authentic self-expression as essential qualities for entrepreneurial success." James paused, setting down the document and looking directly at Margaret. "I want to be absolutely certain you understand the potential consequences of this decision. If Daniel refuses to embrace the very qualities he's asked you to suppress, he would lose not just the financial inheritance, but also the family business you've spent 30 years building." "I understand," Margaret said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "There's also the matter of timing. When do you plan to inform Daniel about these changes?" This was the question that had been keeping Margaret awake at night. The new will would remain her private decision until her death, unless she chose to reveal it earlier as a way of communicating her feelings about Daniel's request. "I think Daniel needs to understand the full implications of what he's asking before he makes his final decision about who he wants me to be," Margaret said slowly. I'm planning to tell him about the will after the Blackstone merger is finalized. That way, his choice won't be influenced by financial concerns. And if he responds by simply accepting the inheritance conditions, if he decides to embrace the dramatic approach you've built your business on? Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering possibilities she hadn't fully explored. Then he'll learn something important about the value of authentic passion in business. And maybe he'll understand that the qualities he finds embarrassing in social settings are actually his greatest professional assets. And if he chooses to reject the inheritance entirely and continue with his corporate career, then he'll have made his priorities clear, and the foundation will ensure that other entrepreneurs who refuse to suppress their authentic selves will benefit from the success I've built. James made a few final notes on his legal pad, then looked up with the expression of someone who had guided many families through complex emotional decisions. Margaret, I've been practicing estate law for over 30 years, and I've seen families destroyed by inheritances used as weapons. I've also seen inheritances used as teaching tools that ultimately strengthen family bonds. The difference usually comes down to the motivation behind the decisions. What do you think my motivation is? I think you love your son deeply, and you're terrified that he's asking you to become someone you don't recognize. I think you're hoping that forcing him to choose between financial security and authentic relationship will help him understand what he's really asking for. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Is that wise? I think it's honest. And sometimes honesty is the only path to authentic relationship, even when it's painful. The signing ceremony itself was surprisingly brief. Margaret's signature flowed across the documents with the same confident flourish she'd used to sign thousands of catering contracts over the years. James's assistant witnessed the signatures, and within 15 minutes, Margaret's lifetime of work and love had been transformed into a legal document that would either educate her son or devastate him. As Margaret prepared to leave the law office, James handed her a sealed envelope. A personal copy of the will, he explained, for your records. And Margaret, you can change this document any time before it becomes effective. If Daniel comes to understand what you're trying to teach him, we can easily modify the inheritance structure. Thank you, James, for everything. Take care of yourself. And remember, love sometimes requires us to make difficult choices that feel cruel in the moment but are ultimately kind in their honesty. Driving home through the November afternoon, Margaret felt a strange sense of lightness, as if she had been carrying a weight she hadn't realized was there. The decision was made, the legal framework established. Now she simply had to wait for the right moment to reveal to Daniel what his request for a less dramatic mother would actually cost him. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway, Elena's name appearing on the dashboard display. How did it go? Elena asked without preamble. It's done. The will is signed, and Daniel's inheritance now depends on him embracing exactly the dramatic approach he wants me to suppress. And how do you feel about that? Margaret sat in her car for a moment, considering the question seriously. Sad, relieved, terrified, and strangely proud. Proud? I built something worth fighting for, Elena. A business that celebrates authentic passion, a life that refuses to apologize for intensity and creativity. If Daniel can't see the value in that, then maybe someone else should benefit from it. When are you going to tell him? After the merger is finalized. I want him to make his choice about who I should be based on love, not money. That evening, Margaret prepared dinner for one in her kitchen, surrounded by the vibrant colors and artistic touches that Daniel found too dramatic. The ceramic bowl from the farmer's market sat on her counter, filled with the autumn fruit she had purchased from vendors who knew her by name. Her walls displayed photographs from hundreds of celebrations, where her passionate approach had transformed ordinary events into extraordinary memories. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt completely comfortable in her own home, completely aligned with her own values. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She still had to navigate Daniel's corporate world without losing herself entirely. But tonight, she could simply be Margaret Sullivan. Successful entrepreneur, devoted mother, and unapologetically dramatic woman who had just made the most important business decision of her life. The inheritance would now reward authenticity rather than conformity, passion rather than propriety. And whether Daniel chose to claim that inheritance would reveal exactly what kind of man she had raised him to be. As Margaret settled into her evening routine, she found herself thinking about Sofia Martinez's speech at the charity gala. The young girl had faced impossible challenges with remarkable courage, refusing to let fear diminish her authentic self. If a 12-year-old could maintain her integrity under such difficult circumstances, surely a grown woman could do the same when faced with her own son's disappointing expectations. The will was signed, the decision made. Now Margaret simply had to find the courage to live with the consequences of choosing authentic love over comfortable conformity. 3 weeks after the will signing, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing what might be the most important dinner of her life. The Blackstone merger had been finalized the previous Friday, with Daniel calling her immediately after the contracts were signed, his voice bubbling with excitement about his new position as Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. He had specifically requested a celebration dinner, wanting to share his success with the woman who had made it all possible. Tonight, Margaret would finally tell him about the will. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing Daniel's favorite meal, herb-crusted rack of lamb with rosemary potatoes and her signature chocolate tart, using the same dramatic presentation style he had asked her to suppress. The dining room table was set with her finest china and crystal, with candles and fresh flowers creating an atmosphere of elegant celebration. If this was to be their last peaceful dinner together, she wanted it to be memorable. Daniel arrived precisely at 7, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had come to fruition. He looked older somehow, more confident in his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair, but Margaret could still see glimpses of the 8-year-old boy who used to help her arrange flowers for catering events. "Mom, you outdid yourself," he said, surveying the elaborate table setting with genuine appreciation. "This looks like something from one of your high-end events." "Only the best for my successful son," Margaret replied, accepting his embrace and noting how he held himself with the careful posture of someone conscious of maintaining professional dignity even in private moments. As they settled into dinner, Daniel regaled her with stories from the merger negotiations, describing complex financial structures and strategic partnerships with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his true calling. Margaret listened with genuine interest, proud of his accomplishments, while simultaneously aware that this might be their last conversation as mother and son who shared an uncomplicated relationship. "The best part," Daniel continued over the main course, "is that I'll be working directly with international clients. The Blackstone network includes firms in London, Tokyo, and Dubai. I could be traveling internationally within 6 months." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. Your father would be so proud to see how far you've come." "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," Daniel said, his expression growing more serious. "About how he never got to see what I could accomplish, but also about how he would have handled the social aspects of this kind of success." Margaret set down her fork, sensing an opening for the conversation she had been dreading. "What do you mean?" "Dad was always so comfortable in any situation. He could talk to construction workers and country club members with equal ease. He never seemed to worry about fitting in or saying the wrong thing." "Your father was confident in who he was," Margaret said carefully. "He never felt the need to change his fundamental nature to accommodate other people's expectations." Daniel was quiet for a moment, cutting his lamb with precise movements. "I suppose that's true. But Dad also had natural social instincts that made him universally liked. He didn't have to work at being appropriate." "And you think I do?" The question hung in the air between them, more direct than Margaret had intended but impossible to retract. Daniel looked up from his plate, clearly recognizing that they had moved beyond casual dinner conversation into more sensitive territory. "Mom, I hope you know how grateful I am for everything you've done to support my career. The way you've adapted your presentation style for the corporate events has been incredibly helpful. Patricia Blackstone specifically mentioned how impressed she was with your sophistication and authenticity." "My authenticity?" Margaret repeated slowly. "Yes, you found a way to be genuinely yourself while still fitting into their social expectations. It's been perfect." Margaret felt something breaking apart inside her chest. "Daniel, what if I told you that the woman you've seen at those corporate events isn't genuinely me at all? What if I told you that every careful word and controlled gesture was a performance designed to meet your expectations, rather than an expression of my authentic self? Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? I mean that for the past 2 months, I've been suppressing everything about my personality that makes me who I am, in order to avoid embarrassing you. I've been pretending to be someone else entirely. But you seemed so natural at those events, so comfortable. I'm a good actress when I need to be, but acting isn't the same as being authentic, Daniel. And the woman who impressed Patricia Blackstone was a carefully constructed character, not your actual mother. Daniel set down his fork entirely, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked like concern. Mom, I think you're overthinking this. No one asked you to become a different person. I just asked you to be a little more mindful of the social context. You asked me to be less dramatic, less passionate, less enthusiastic, less everything that defines who I am. I ask you to adapt to professional settings, the way anyone does when they want to make a good impression. Margaret stood up and walked to the sideboard where she had placed the sealed envelope containing her copy of the new will. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make irrevocable. Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. Something I hope will help you understand what you've really been asking me to do. She returned to the table and placed the envelope between them, her heart pounding with the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. 3 weeks ago, I changed my will. Daniel's face went pale. What do you mean you changed your will? Are you sick? Is something wrong? I'm perfectly healthy. I changed my will because I needed you to understand the true cost of asking someone to suppress their authentic self for other people's comfort. With shaking hands, Daniel opened the envelope and began reading the legal document. Margaret watched his expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and growing comprehension as he absorbed the inheritance conditions. You're requiring me to work in your catering business for 2 years before I can inherit anything? I'm requiring you to embrace the same dramatic, passionate approach to business that you've asked me to suppress in social settings. You would need to demonstrate authentic enthusiasm for client relations, creative problem solving, and all the expressive qualities that have made Sullivan Catering successful. Daniel continued reading, his voice growing tighter with each provision. And if I choose not to meet these requirements, everything goes to a foundation celebrating dramatic passion and authentic self-expression in entrepreneurship? That's correct. Daniel set down the will and stared at his mother with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of hurt, anger, and something that looked like betrayal. This is blackmail, Mom. You're using your inheritance to force me to become someone I'm not. The irony of his statement was so profound that Margaret actually laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. Daniel, listen to what you just said. You're angry because I'm asking you to become someone you're not, in order to inherit money. But for the past 2 months, you've been asking me to become someone I'm not in order to inherit your respect and approval. That's completely different. How? How is it different? Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking Margaret's garden. Because what I asked you to do was reasonable. I asked you to modify your behavior slightly for specific social situations. You're asking me to completely change my career path and personality. No, I'm asking you to choose. You can continue with your corporate career exactly as you planned, Daniel. Nothing is stopping you from becoming the most successful financial executive in New York. But if you make that choice, you'll be doing so with the full knowledge of what you're giving up. And what exactly am I giving up? Margaret joined him at the window, looking out at the garden she had designed with the same dramatic flair that characterized everything she touched. You're giving up a business built on authentic passion. You're giving up a legacy that celebrates creativity and genuine human connection. You're giving up the opportunity to learn that the qualities you find embarrassing in me are actually the secret to building something meaningful. And if I choose the inheritance, if I agree to work in your business, then you'll discover whether the dramatic approach you want me to suppress actually has value. You'll learn what it means to build relationships based on authentic enthusiasm rather than careful calculation. And maybe you'll understand why I refuse to apologize for being passionate about life. They stood in silence for several minutes, both staring out at the garden, where autumn had painted everything in brilliant shades of red and gold. Finally, Daniel turned to face his mother, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. What if I can't do it, Mom? What if I try to work in your business and I'm terrible at the dramatic, passionate approach? What if I'm just not built for that kind of authenticity? Then you'll learn something important about yourself, and you'll make your choice with full knowledge of who you really are. And our relationship? What happens to us while I'm making this decision? Margaret reached out and took her son's hands, noting how they trembled slightly in hers. Our relationship survives, Daniel, because it's built on love, not inheritance conditions. I will always be your mother, and I will always support your happiness. But I won't pretend to be someone else to make your life easier. Daniel pulled his hands free and walked back to the table, staring down at the will as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Take all the time you need. The will doesn't become effective until I die, which I hope won't be for many years. But Daniel, during that time, I'm going to be myself. Fully, dramatically, passionately myself. If that embarrasses you in corporate settings, you'll need to decide whether our relationship is worth that discomfort. As Daniel prepared to leave, carrying the copy of the will and looking older than his 32 years, he paused at the front door. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were building your business, did you ever consider taking a safer, more conventional approach? Something that would have guaranteed success without requiring you to be so visible? Margaret smiled, remembering the young widow who had started catering book club meetings with borrowed platters and determination. Every single day, sweetheart. But I realized that success without authenticity isn't really success at all. It's just survival with better accessories. After Daniel left, Margaret cleaned up the dinner dishes and reflected on the evening's revelations. The conversation had been as difficult as she had anticipated, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in months, she had spoken to her son with complete honesty about who she was and what she valued. The outcome was uncertain. Daniel might choose his corporate career and walk away from his inheritance entirely. He might attempt to meet the will's conditions and discover he genuinely enjoyed the dramatic approach to business. Or he might find some third option that Margaret hadn't considered. But regardless of Daniel's ultimate decision, Margaret knew she had made the right choice. She had refused to sacrifice her authentic self for social acceptance, and she had created a legal framework that would either educate her son about the value of passionate authenticity or ensure that other entrepreneurs who embraced their dramatic natures would benefit from her life's work. As she settled into her evening routine, surrounded by the vibrant colors and bold choices that defined her home, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since this whole crisis began. She was, once again, unapologetically herself. And that, she realized, was the most valuable inheritance she could leave behind. Not money or property, but the example of a woman who refused to dim her light for anyone's comfort. The story would end as it had begun, with Margaret Sullivan choosing dramatic authenticity over safe conformity. And whatever consequences that choice brought, she would face them as herself, completely and without apology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.